My aunts invited me to an elegant lunch, promising a special day, but when I arrived, I was directed to the kids' table, far from the family conversations. While everyone enjoyed themselves, I counted the minutes, my heart heavy, realizing that my presence was merely a formality. By the end of the day, when dessert arrived, one of my aunts turned to me and, with a cold smile, said, "You don't belong to us." Laughter echoed around me, and I found myself alone, fighting back tears. My name is Raphael. Betrayal often comes from those we least expect. Those words cut like a knife. My Aunt Louisa's smile, which had once seemed welcoming, now felt like a symbol of the rejection I had always sensed. The kids' table was filled with cousins I barely knew, who seemed more interested in their own conversations than including me. I heard laughter and jokes that weren't part of my repertoire, while my gaze wandered to the adults' table. There, the conversations were vibrant, full of shared stories and experiences, but I was stuck in a corner, a stranger in what should have been a familiar environment. Beatrice, my cousin, was there, but even she seemed hesitant to invite me into the conversation. I watched her from a distance, realizing that her loyalty was divided. It was hard not to feel like a pariah, someone who didn't fit in anywhere. The walls of the room seemed to close in on me, and the soft music in the background only emphasized my isolation. The delicious aroma of food filled the air, but I couldn't savor anything. With every bite the others took, I felt a knot in my throat. What I really wanted was to be heard, to be seen, to be part of the conversation. Life at the kids' table was a series of smiles and furtive glances that only heightened my sense of alienation. My heart raced at the thought of my aunt's words. I didn't belong to them. But how could I belong to a family that didn't fully accept me? The dynamic among the adults was slowly shifting. I could see my father, Carlos, casting a discontented glance at my mother, Anna. They had always had their differences, and that lunch seemed like fertile ground for new discord to blossom. Carlos was quieter than usual, as if preparing for a confrontation, but he didn't know with whom or how. The conversations around him grew increasingly tense, and I feared the atmosphere might become unbearable, leading to an outcome I didn't want to witness. When a disagreement arose between Luisa and Anna over who should have brought dessert, I knew the environment could explode at any moment. I looked again at Beatrice, who was having fun with her cousins, but I sensed her joy was superficial. Her internal struggle was evident. She had always been a peacemaker, trying to unite the family, but today she seemed lost between the pressure from the adults and the need to be by my side. This hurt me more than I cared to admit. Her phone vibrated constantly with messages, and I imagined they were words of encouragement, but maybe they were just more responsibilities she had to face. What I wanted was to scream for her, to ask for help, but shame and pride held me back. How sad it was to need someone so close, yet feel they were so far away. The conversations at the adults' table began to rise in volume, and soon I could hear some scattered words: disrespect, missing, betrayal. My mind raced away, trying not to get caught up. Instead, I reflected on the meaning of family. What did it really mean to be part of a group that seemed more focused on maintaining appearances than on caring for one another? The idea of love and loyalty seemed to have faded among criticisms and misunderstandings. I realized that the love in my family was conditional, accompanied by judgments and expectations. This only deepened my anguish. Anna was trying to smooth things over, but her gentle voice and conciliatory tone seemed insufficient. I could see her anguished expression, as if she knew she was trapped between two worlds, a conflicted husband and a son longing for acceptance. It was painful to watch her struggle to maintain harmony in such a tumultuous environment. At one moment, our eyes met, and I could feel the mix of sadness and love radiating from her. It wasn't just me who was fighting, everyone there was, each in their own way, trying to find their place in a family that seemed to be disintegrating. The atmosphere was growing increasingly charged, as if a storm were about to break. Louisa, with her authoritative manner, began to ask provocative questions about our lives, and each response seemed like another opportunity to expose each other's flaws. I tensed, waiting for a moment when someone would reveal a painful truth about me. Suddenly, Carlos, in a moment of desperation, stood up from the table, his voice slicing through the air. He began to speak about his frustrations with the family, and I realized it was a cry for attention, a call for everyone to wake up to the reality of our situation. The impact of his words reverberated through the room. Everyone stopped what they were doing, and the attention turned to him. My father, who had always been a distant and conflicted figure, was now exposed, vulnerable. The tension increased, and for a moment, the silence was more deafening than any shout. I wondered if this could be a turning point, the moment when the truth would finally be revealed. But deep down, I feared that it would only deepen the wounds. The words Carlos spoke were heavy with pain and frustration, but also with a desperate desire for reconciliation, and I didn't know how it would all unfold. The atmosphere at the kids' table felt so light compared to the weight I felt in my chest. As the others laughed and talked about their interests, I wondered if I would ever feel part of that group. Beatrice, my cousin, sat next to me, and I noticed her eyes seemed restless. She too saw the division between the adults and us, but wasn't sure how to react. I talked to her about trivial things, trying to maintain a facade of normalcy, but the silence between us spoke louder than any conversation. I felt like we were in an invisible battlefield where loyalties were tested and family ties grew tense. Her gaze, which often met mine, seemed to reflect the same dilemma I faced. Our mothers were sisters, but the differences between them created a chill that pushed us apart. As I chewed on a piece of meat, my mind drifted back to what was happening at the adults' table. Carlos was probably trying to voice his frustrations, and Anna was likely trying to calm him down. I wished she could see me, to realize how much I needed her at that moment. The only image I could imagine was my father slamming his hand on the table, his voice raised, creating a wave of discomfort that radiated through the space. My heart sank at the thought that even during moments of celebration, discord always seemed to lurk nearby. The kids' table was slowly filling up with plates of desserts and laughter, but I still felt distant, like I was observing the scene from the outside. Beatrice leaned in a little closer and spoke softly to me. "Do you think they're going to fight again?" I didn't know how to respond. I knew that family tension never fully disappeared, but part of me wished this time would be different. With a determined gesture, I stood up, saying I needed a moment to clear my head. The pressure in my temples was rising, and I knew that if I stayed there, I would be consumed by anxiety. As I stepped out into the yard, the cool breeze enveloped me, and I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. However, the sight of the blue sky and the bright sun couldn't dispel the cloud of uncertainty hanging over me. As I walked through the garden, I saw Louisa, my aunt, watching the adults through the window. She seemed oblivious to the chaos, but I knew she was responsible for it all. Louisa always had a knack for turning these lunches into spectacles, and I wondered if she really cared about everyone's happiness or just about the image she projected. Our families had always been a big show, but the play was becoming increasingly dramatic. I decided I needed to talk to her, but I wasn't sure I had the courage. I went back inside the house, and as soon as I entered, I heard Carlos shouting, "You never listen to me, Anna. I'm tired of fighting alone." The anger in his voice was palpable, and I froze at the door, unable to decide whether to intervene or not. The heat of the argument made me feel a mix of sadness and outrage. Part of me wanted to shout that I was here too, that my needs and feelings mattered, but the words got lost in my throat. With effort, I approached the adults' table, and the voices began to quiet down. Anna shot me a worried look, while Carlos seemed surprised to see me. The tense atmosphere was almost tangible, and I realized that the impact of my presence could be decisive. I just wanted to know if I could help," I said, my voice trembling. The silence that followed was deafening, and I wondered if I had made a mistake. Louisa, noticing the shift in dynamics, smiled in a conspiratorial way. "Raphael, you're always welcome to help. How about you bring us some drinks?" The way she said it made me feel there was something behind her offer. She wanted me to take on a role, even if it was just a distraction. Anna nodded, as if she saw in me an opportunity to ease the tension. I went to the kitchen, where I found sodas and juices, and as I prepared them, I couldn't shake the thought that, even here, everything could change. When I returned to the living room, the atmosphere was more relaxed, but resentment still lingered in the air. Anna took my hand and pulled me closer, whispering, "Thank you for being here." Her simple gesture warmed my heart. And I realized that despite all the pain and confusion, there was still room for a bond. Beatrice approached, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. She too wanted everything to be okay, but doubt still surrounded her like a shadow. The conversation began to flow more easily. Topics shifted to childhood memories, and somehow Carlos started to open up. The tension slowly dissipated, as if there was a new chance for us. However, I knew that underneath, unresolved issues still awaited, ready to be reignited at any moment. Still, in that instant, I felt a renewed connection. It was a small step, but who knows, maybe one day this lunch could be remembered as the moment we decided to truly come together. With a deep sigh, I allowed myself to dream that, despite the wounds, there might still be hope for all of us. For those following the story, if you'd like to know more about the complexities of family life and the emotions that surround these relationships, don't forget to subscribe to catch the next chapters. As I watched the animated conversations at the adults' table, a wave of frustration washed over me. Louisa was gesturing enthusiastically, making everyone laugh, and the feeling of being invisible intensified. I wondered how I could be part of that joy that seemed so distant from me. I was raised to believe that family was a safe harbor, but the truth was that I felt more like an intruder. The delicious smell of food coming from the kitchen was almost unbearable, a stark contrast to the emptiness filling my heart. Anna, my mother, glanced at me from time to time, as if trying to find a way to include me, but her attempts were thwarted by the tension in the air. Carlos, my father, was off in a corner, wrapped up in his own internal battle. He struggled to deal with what was happening in our family, and I often wondered if he truly believed he could change anything. His distant gaze and heavy silence spoke louder than 1,000 words. Tension was mounting, and I knew I couldn't just sit and watch. I stood up, deciding to approach the adults' table, driven by a mix of courage and desperation. As I got closer, I could hear fragments of the conversation. Beatrice was defending Carlos, trying to explain his actions, while Louisa countered, bringing up issues from the past that no one wanted to discuss. I knew those stories, was aware of the flaws and secrets everyone hid, but hearing them laid bare at a family lunch felt different. "Why don't you join us, Raphael?" Beatrice asked, looking at me with a forced smile. She was always caught between loyalty to the family and a desire to support me. Her gaze conveyed a silent plea for me to follow her, but doubt paralyzed me. She was my cousin, but in many ways she felt like a stranger, just as I was to everyone there. "I'm fine here," I replied, my tone betraying my frustration. It wasn't just the exclusion that bothered me. It was the feeling that everyone was living their lives while I was trapped in an emotional limbo. Beatrice hesitated, and I realized she didn't know how to handle the situation. The environment around us seemed to close in, as if the walls were tightening, reinforcing the claustrophobia of those relationships. Anna finally stood up, determined to intervene. "Raphael, come here, we need to talk," she said, her tone leaving no room for objections. Her look was one of concern, but there was also a determination I admired. I was compelled to let her guide me away from the kids' table, and as we walked, I felt the tension rising. "Are you okay?" Anna asked, her soft voice contrasting with the rigidity of the environment. It was an attempt to calm me, but I knew what was at stake was much greater than my discomfort. "I'm trying to figure out where I fit in," I replied, feeling the knot in my throat tighten. "It seems like nothing I do is enough to be accepted." She took a deep breath, as if weighing the words she would choose next. "Raphael, you should know that we all struggle in some way. Family can be complicated, and I also feel lost at times," she said, looking at me with sincerity. That revelation brought some comfort, but it also awakened a sense of responsibility. Should I be the link that united us all, even when the pain and resentment were so evident? As we talked, a discussion at the adults' table began to heat up. Louisa raised her voice, and Carlos couldn't hold back, unleashing a torrent of words that echoed through the space. His tone was defensive, as if he were battling ghosts from the past that had come back to haunt our family. The tense atmosphere made me hesitate to continue my conversation with Anna, but I knew it was time to confront the truth. With renewed courage, I said to her, "Maybe it's time for all of us to talk about what's really happening. We can't just ignore the problems." Anna looked at me, and in her eyes was a recognition that I was right. "You're right, Raphael. We need to face this together, even if it hurts," she replied, her tone now filled with determination. Hearing her words ignited a spark of hope within me. I wasn't alone in the struggle. Together, we could challenge the conflicts that divided us. As we decided our next step, I couldn't shake the feeling that this would be a pivotal moment for me and for everyone. The lunch, which began as a celebration, was about to transform into an emotional battleground where hidden truths would finally be revealed. And as scary as that was, I felt it was the path I needed to take to finally find my place in this family full of nuances and conflicts. As I prepared to return, the noise from the discussion at the adults' table grew louder, and the smell of food began to mix with the palpable tension in the air. I knew the conversation that would follow wouldn't be easy. But part of me was eager to see if we could finally understand each other. What would this gathering be if not an opportunity for transformation? It was time to unlock the doors that had been locked for so long. When I returned to the table, Carlos's expression was a mix of anger and despair. What he was about to say could change everything. Louisa, with her keen eyes, seemed to sense that the situation was about to explode, and, in an unexpected move, decided to steer the conversation in another direction. But I had already made my decision. I could no longer remain silent. "Guys, we need to talk about what's happening here," I declared, my voice slightly louder than I intended. Silence fell over everyone, and I felt every gaze turn toward me. The weight of expectation was almost unbearable, but I wouldn't back down. Adrenaline surged through my veins, and for the first time, I felt I had control of the situation. I don't want to be the cousin who's left out anymore. I want to understand and be understood, I continued, looking from face to face among the familiar ones. The reaction was mixed. Some looked surprised, others reluctant. But there was a thread of hope, a possibility for dialogue hanging in the air. And for a brief moment, I felt we were finally beginning to come together, not as a perfect family, but as a group of people wanting to be honest with each other, despite all the past wounds. As I sat at the kids' table, surrounded by cousins I hardly knew, I tried to focus on the conversations around me. Beatrice was a little further away, chatting animatedly with a group that seemed to be enjoying themselves with stories and jokes. I wanted to join her, but an invisible force kept me stuck in that corner. In truth, I felt like an intruder in a circle that should be welcoming but had suddenly turned into a hostile space. My hands were restless under the table, and I wondered if my feelings of inadequacy were evident to others. One of my younger cousins, Lucas, started asking questions about school, trying to strike up a conversation. As he talked about his grades and plans for vacation, I just nodded, lost in thought. It felt like I was in a movie where all the characters knew the script, but I was an actor improvising without knowing what to say. The idea that I was on the sidelines of the main conversation at the adults' table left me distressed. I wanted to shout that I also had stories to tell, experiences to share, but insecurity silenced me. Across the table, I could see Anna struggling to maintain harmony. She was standing, trying to mediate a discussion that had started between Carlos and Luisa. The tension was palpable, and I could feel my heart race as I realized that once again, the family dynamic was about to break. Luisa was gesturing dramatically, while Carlos seemed irritated, his cutting words echoing around the room. I looked at Beatrice, who shot me a worried glance, as if she wanted to say something, but didn't know how to speak up in the face of the approaching storm. The atmosphere shifted, and the festive mood began to dissipate. It was as if the shine of the conversations and laughter had been overshadowed by clouds of discontent. I knew my parents and aunts had their own internal battles, but I just wanted to understand what my place was among them. The idea of being a pillar of support or even a mediator felt impossible. I was still trying to find my own space. When I finally dared to raise my voice, all I managed to say was a timid, "Can you please stop arguing?" My request was met with surprised looks, and I felt even more out of place. Anna, sensing the tension building, quickly intervened, asking everyone to sit down and relax. She tried to bring the focus back to lunch, suggesting that everyone share a funny memory they had as a family. The silence that followed was almost deafening, and I felt my stomach churn. The idea of recalling good moments felt like a futile attempt to heal open wounds. However, something inside me felt that maybe this was an opportunity. If everyone could talk, perhaps I could share how I felt too. When it was my turn, I hesitated. I wanted to share the difficulty of feeling excluded, but the words got stuck in my throat. Instead, I shared a memory about a family outing we took when I was a child, when everything seemed simpler. As I spoke, I noticed the environment shifting. Some smiles appeared, and expressions of hostility began to dissipate. Anna, beside me, seemed relieved, and I wondered if she noticed my effort. But as the stories began to flow, I could also see Beatrice squirming in her chair, clearly struggling with the divisions hovering over us. The fact that she was a bridge between the two generations made her a complicated figure. I knew her loyalties were divided. On one hand, she wanted to support the family, but on the other, she didn't want to be the cause of more conflict. This made me feel even more alone, knowing that while I was trying to assert myself, Beatrice was struggling not to become a target of criticism. I watched her, trying to decipher her expressions, hoping she would give me a sign that everything would be okay. Then, without warning, Luisa stood up again and brought up a subject I thought had been buried: Carlos's work choices and how they affected our family dynamic. The tension rose again, and I found myself in a sea of conflicting opinions. Carlos, with a loud and cutting voice, defended his decisions, while Luisa recounted moments when our family really needed him. The festive mood had vanished, and I felt at the center of a hurricane. What was supposed to be a moment of unity was turning into a battleground. With my heart racing, I realized it was time for me to take a clearer stand. I could no longer be a passive spectator. I stood up, and all eyes turned to me. With a knot in my throat, I finally let everything I had been holding back spill out. I just want us to be a real family, without fights and without secrets. I need you all, and I don't know how to deal with this anymore. The words flowed out of me with a sincerity I didn't know I possessed, and the reactions were varied. While some looked surprised, others appeared contemplative. The voices fell silent, and I realized that somehow I had broken a barrier. The weight of the truth seemed to hang in the air, and the tension began to gradually dissolve. Anna looked at me with silent pride, while Luisa seemed to reflect on the impact of her actions. Even Carlos, visibly affected, remained silent, as if pondering the validity of my statement. What would follow was uncertain, but I finally felt I had taken the first step toward acceptance and truth in our family. The silence that followed my declaration felt heavy, laden with emotions we all tried to hide. The adults' table, once vibrant with laughter and animated exchanges, was now becoming a tense space where every glance and every breath carried significant weight. I wondered if I had truly broken an invisible cycle that kept us all trapped in our designated roles. Anna's expectation toward me seemed to shine through, contrasting with Carlos's expression, which remained a mix of surprise and concern, unsure of how to respond. Luisa, on the other hand, was watching, as if evaluating the impact I had caused, perhaps contemplating the consequences of her actions and the dynamic she had fostered over the years. At the kids' table, Beatrice was trying to hide the tension between us, but it was evident she felt the weight of the situation too. Her loyalty was being tested, and I couldn't help but wonder if she felt as lost as I did amid all of this. "You shouldn't have spoken that way," she whispered, glancing at the adults as if fearing they might hear her concern. I looked at her, trying to convey that it was time for all of us to face reality, but I knew she was in a delicate position. "Sometimes it takes breaking the silence for the truth to come to light," I replied, my voice revealing more determination than insecurity. As the conversations at the adults' table shifted, I noticed Anna trying to intervene, attempting to smooth over the situation with a comment about the main course. But my declaration still hung in the air, like a dark cloud on a sunny day. The conversations became more superficial, and the true essence of what was happening dissolved into forced jokes and nervous smiles. It was as if everyone was trying to avoid confrontation, but I knew it wouldn't last. The moment of truth was approaching, and I needed to be prepared for what would come next. Over time, I noticed that although the tension was palpable, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The interactions that had once been quick and disconnected began to intertwine with a new purpose. I realized that even in the most mundane conversations, there was an implicit attempt to restore connection. The adults, in their troubled way of dealing with emotions, were trying to restore some balance. This made me think that maybe there was hope for all of us. The search for family acceptance wasn't just mine, it was everyone's at the table. As I reflected on this, Luisa finally broke the silence. "Raphael, you are part of this family, and we want you to feel that way," she said, but her words carried a different meaning. It seemed she was trying to redeem herself for something she didn't quite understand. This revelation made me realize that each of us was fighting our internal battles, perhaps trapped by expectations we never asked for. "If this is true, then why can't we just be who we are?" I replied, once again challenging the status quo. The entire table fell silent, as if waiting for the answer that had yet to be formulated. Carlos, who had been quieter until then, finally decided to intervene. "Raphael, you need to understand that things aren't that simple. Family is complicated," he began, but I interrupted him, frustration overflowing. "Complicated or just blind, Dad? I'm not asking you to change. I just want you to see that I'm not a stranger. I'm your son." The desperation in my voice echoed through the space, and I realized I was trying not only to assert myself, but also to confront him. With that, a wave of understanding seemed to shake the adults' table, and I saw a glimpse of pain in Carlos's eyes. He was battling his own demons, and for a moment it seemed he might actually see the truth I was trying to convey. Anna watched all of this with a tender and sad gaze, her heart torn between love for the family and the pain of seeing her son fight for a space that should be innate. She had always been the mediator, trying to unite what was fragmented, but I felt that this responsibility shouldn't rest solely on her. "We all need to be more honest with each other," I suggested, feeling that the conversation was finally taking a positive turn. "That's how we can heal." Beatrice, beside me, nodded slightly, as if she was finally allowing her loyalty to align with what she truly believed. Luisa, realizing the situation required more than empty words, proposed a toast. "Let's celebrate family," she said, raising her glass. "No matter our differences, we still have each other." The gesture was well received, but there was a new dimension to that proposal. The toast wasn't just a symbolic act. It was an invitation to vulnerability, an opportunity for all of us to open up and forge a stronger bond. And so, as the clinking of glasses mingled with the murmur of voices, I felt there was a path ahead of us, a path that might lead us to a future where acceptance and love were the foundations that held our family together. Now, looking at the faces around me, I realized that each of us had a role to play in rewriting our family story. The struggle for acceptance that I had always sought was not mine alone, but shared by all. The lunch, which began as a moment of division, was transforming into an opportunity for renewal. And deep down, I knew that no matter what happened next, this was the first step toward the true connection we all longed for. After all, we all deserved a place where we could be accepted, with all our imperfections and vulnerabilities. If you have ever been through similar situations in your family, share your story. Together, we can find strength in the experiences that unite us. The atmosphere at the kids' table was relaxed, but I couldn't join in the excitement that permeated the environment. While Beatrice chatted with her friends, I lost myself in thought. The feeling of being in a place where I didn't belong wrapped around me like a heavy cloak. I remembered how I had always dreamed of being part of the adults group, sharing laughter and stories, but there I was, on the sidelines, like a shadow waiting for a moment that never came. The delicious aroma of the dishes Louisa had prepared mixed with the distant sound of animated conversations. I knew she was trying to keep everything under control, but the truth was that family tensions seemed to overflow, even in the smallest interactions. Carlos, my father, had been more reserved than usual, as if he were battling internal demons, and Anna, my mother, was trying to smooth over the rough edges, nervously laughing and making comments to lighten the heavy atmosphere. At the same time, I watched Beatrice, who alternated between friends and the adults' table, always with a worried look. It was as if she were in a balancing act, trying not to offend anyone, but in the process, losing a bit of herself. This ambiguity made me question whether she too felt the pressure to choose a side, just like I did. I decided to stand up and go to the adults' table, the impulse to connect overcoming the fear of rejection. "Hey, what are you all talking about?" I asked, trying to break the ice. Louisa's look toward me was a mix of surprise and sudden expectation. Carlos didn't lift his eyes from his plate, and Anna smiled, but the tension was palpable. "We're just reminiscing about stories from our childhood," Louisa replied, trying to sound casual. "Do you remember that time we all went to the beach and—" But before she could finish, Carlos interrupted. "Rafael, you don't need to hear this. Go have fun with your cousins." His tone was harsh, and I felt a knot forming in my stomach. What was happening at that table? The memory of a happy summer was becoming a distant echo, lost among unspoken words and repressed resentments. I returned to the kids' table, unsure if I had done the right thing. The conversation continued to be lively, but I was distant, lost in reflections. Beatrice noticed my silence and leaned in to talk to me. "Hey, are you okay? You look like you're in another world." The concern in her eyes touched me, and for a moment I felt there might be a genuine connection there, even if the circumstances were complicated. "I'm just thinking," I replied, wishing I could put into words the whirlwind of emotions that overwhelmed me. "Sometimes it's hard to find my place here." She nodded in understanding. "I feel that too, you know? It's like there's always pressure to please everyone, and it's hard to be true to yourself." That confession surprised me. The loyalty that worried her was also a shadow in my life. As we talked, I realized that Beatrice and I were more alike than I had imagined. Our internal struggles seemed intertwined, connected by an invisible thread of seeking acceptance. Her gaze reflected a mix of relief and sadness, and I felt less alone, even though the situation around us remained tense. At the adults' table, voices were rising. Louisa was trying to bring back the lightness, but Carlos was restless, and Anna seemed frustrated. The atmosphere was heating up, and a sarcastic comment from Carlos cast a cloud of discomfort over everyone. He was clearly in conflict, and this was reflected in his words. With every phrase, I felt a piece of the family structure I longed for being threatened by unresolved grievances. The tension transformed into an open argument, and I knew it was time to act. I stood up again, determined to interrupt the spiral of criticisms and hurts. "Guys, can we stop for a second?" My voice echoed through the room, interrupting the negative flow that had settled in. Everyone turned to look at me, and for a moment, silence filled the space. I know we all have our differences, but that doesn't mean we can't respect each other. It's a family lunch, and it should be about unity, not conflicts. The words came out of me with more firmness than I expected. It was as if something had broken inside me, and I was finally allowing myself to speak. Carlos looked at me, surprised. Anna appeared a mix of relief and pride. Luisa, in turn, smiled encouragingly, as if she were rooting for me. Beatrice, beside me, looked at me with a spark in her eyes, perhaps seeing in me a reflection of her own struggle. And then, something changed. The tension began to dissipate, and conversations became more gentle. A smile began to form on faces, and I realized that, even amid all the imperfections, there was room for a new beginning. And as much as the journey would be long and filled with challenges, perhaps this lunch would be a crucial step in the search for the acceptance I had always wanted. So, as the dishes were served and laughter rang out more freely, I felt I had finally found a place. And even though the wounds were still there, the hope for a more harmonious future began to shine.